Okay, we have Cheryl White here, and she is the Associate Professor of History at Louisiana State University in Shreveport. And she's going to be presenting a paper called "The Role of Epistemology in Approaching Truth in the Shroud of Turin." And in one sentence, what is epistemology?
Epistemology is a way of knowing how we come to know things.
How we come to know things. Okay, I've always wondered how I came to know things, and so we have a clock here.
Epistemologies, Russ.
Epistemology. See okay. There's your clock, and you have until 12 noon on the clock.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Away,
I will.
Let's give
I will.
Cheryl a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you. I come here today, as he introduced me, primarily as an academic historian, but I also am a trained philosopher, something that makes me of great use to LSU system because I'm able to teach in two disciplines. What I wanted to do today is going to be sort of framed in a historical perspective, and certainly I'm going to be addressing some aspects of my talk from the field of history, but it's primarily a philosophical exploration. I ask you to hang with me. I really do hope that this can be accessible to people. We live in an age where actually I think it's very hard for us to imagine that there are things that human beings are not capable of. We live in an age where human capacity has been elevated to probably the highest point ever in history in terms of what man has been able to accomplish. So it's going to be perhaps a little bit humbling today to speak about us being perhaps needing to put ourselves in a posture of realizing that there are limits to the human capacity and that there are limits to the finite human mind. I want to begin by pointing out something that I know is rather obvious to everyone, and this is because Russ spoke last night about this, and I know that one of the speakers this morning spoke about this, but it needs to be said again, especially in a philosophical context, because this is the most studied object in all of human history. And I want to sort of let that sit on you again for a moment, let that settle, to realize that is not an exaggeration. We have said this throughout this conference and throughout all of the published proceedings of the previous conferences. This has been noted, the hundreds of thousands of hours that have been devoted to the study of this 14.5-foot long piece of linen cloth. As a matter of fact, the data that has been collected from this 14.5-foot long strip of linen cloth is overwhelming. It's overwhelming. Every new scrutiny, every new measure, every new test, every inquiry that has been applied to the Shroud of Turin has yielded more questions, which is a real peculiarity to previous historical artifacts that have been studied. All of this activity, all this human endeavor, all of this examination has been directed really toward one primary end, and that is to reach the truth. To reach the truth about what the Shroud of Turin is. Yet, even though more is known about this historical artifact than any other in history, Shroud investigation to this point, 115 years now later, Shroud investigation can tell us what the cloth is not what it is, with a definitive answer. So this situation, again, very unique in the study of historical artifacts, this situation very naturally invites a philosophical perspective. And within the broad license of the field of philosophy, I'm also going to take another liberty today, I have a very broad license within that field anyway, more so than the field of history, is to take the opportunity to use one of the best primary historical sources that I'm aware of. I'm going to be using the gospel narrative of St. John in order to frame an exploration of epistemology. Epistemology. Now don't let that word scare you. It's very simple. Really all it means is, as Russ asked me a minute ago, it means a way of knowing. How do human beings know anything with certainty? How do we come to know it? And once we know it, how do we process that as truth? How do we walk away and say that is the truth? Now, I'm going to begin with a very fundamental This is Philosophy 101. There is this natural progression that truth is absolute, it is accessible, it is knowable to man, and this is how we get there philosophically using the logic of the ancients, the earliest philosophers. We come to this by this way. Human beings have a desire to know truth. Therefore, truth must exist. And if truth exists, then truth must be knowable. It is a logical progression. So, since we know this is a basic philosophical premise, then you can take this and apply this to anything that humankind studies, including, obviously, the Shroud of Turin. Objects of the material world, and this is very important. I want to make this distinction up front for reasons that will become more obvious. Objects of the material world always yield their answers. They always give up conclusions. They always give up their information. And certainly something that has been studied as much as the Shroud of Turin has been. Okay, so we're going to go with the authorities here. This is actually Raphael Sanzio's School of Athens, just to give some credit to Raphael this morning. Looking back to the time of our foundations of thought rest, with beginning there and going through the Age of the Enlightenment, and even bring us right up to about the 18th century, there is this presumption among mankind, universal truth, an absolute that can be reached. From the Platonic Doctrine of Forms, that has established the foundations of what would become a faith-based epistemology, to the Aristotelian model of the universe, of the unmoved mover that depends upon empirical, observable evidence in the natural world. You have these two very different epistemologies that emerge. Philosophy has used this as the foundation. I mean, like it or not, the way we think in the West is informed by these two ancient philosophers. It's informed by Plato and Aristotle. How we come to understand anything depends on these two epistemologies. So throughout classical antiquity, late classical antiquity and into the early Middle Ages, high Middle Ages, these two philosophies, these epistemologies of the ancients, found their way into further expression into Western thought through some pretty significant people. St. Augustine of Hippo, of course, is the Neo-Platonist who makes sure that the Platonic epistemology becomes fused with Western Christian thought, and that the elevation of faith, for Augustine, the elevation of faith as a way of knowing anything was the purest possible knowledge. To know something that is unseen and unobservable is a purer kind of knowledge. Now, fast forward a few hundred years just to the Aristotelian St. Thomas Aquinas, and he takes Aristotle's observable empirical universe and makes that, doesn't make it superior to faith, but he actually fuses it with Augustine. All that is to say that these two ways of knowing then continue to inform us today. I dare say there's not a person in this room who doesn't think primarily using one of these epistemologies, often moving in and out of them throughout our day and not even realizing how we are applying our approach to knowledge. Is it something I must see and touch and observe and measure? Is it something I just know because I'm basing it on some authority that I've received from the past? There are these two different ways of knowing. And I hope you're going to see why this is important. Over the centuries that have passed since the Shroud of Turin into the historical, perhaps been a suspicion, I think will become obvious, and each is rooted in an ancient wisdom that great Christian philosophers found great merit in and have handed down to us. So, till the late 19th century, anybody who venerated this cloth did so from the perspective of what? faith. Because for the 15th century pilgrim on the shroud that we can see from a distance of 8 to 10 feet. Nobody in the 15th. So they venerated from a standpoint of faith, of the full image on the cloth, which we knew. The epistemology shifted naturally. All of a sudden, with the advent of photography, we are able to see so the epistemology we shift to looking at this with the lens of science, empiricism. So there is a natural shift that takes place. Plato taught that human being fullness to miss the fullness of the truth, because our humans are physical, right? So this is actually very simply and perhaps most eloquently illustrated in Plato's Republic, where he tells anybody ever watched the movie? Okay, then you know the allegory. This is kind of important because they are bound together so that they cannot move and cannot see anything other a realer world, a light, a world behind the cave, beyond them that they cannot see. They don't know that. They are limited to the deceptive physical reality of the shadows they're looking at. Now, Plato's implicit warning in this on the senses to rely only what can be observed and received through sensory inputs is, and he uses these prisoners in the cave as the example of incorporated this, but that we receive with some authority, pure knowledge. Meanwhile, Plato's student Aristotle believed that reality was actually through observation. It was theory to Aristotle with freshman college students. So if you missed the point, I'm not doing this to make you feel bad. Answer, anybody. Where is it? It's in the parking lot? How do you know? Exposition with college students. This usually split about 50-50. About 50% see it, but I have faith because that's where I left it. That was my last experience with it, right? That illustrates the point I'm trying to make, is that for Plato, for Aristotle would say, if you can't see your car, it's not there. Well, not yet. In 100 years, we might have to have a different conversation. So, chemists, botanists, forensic experts, medical experts from every field, anthropologists, historian, cloths to say we want to find the truth. All these different perspectives. And there's something that is quite intriguing, actually very beguiling about one of the things I love is that I can fix a beginning and I can fix an ending and I can look at all the factual data points in between. And there is a comfort and a predictability that comes with the order of being able to tell the narrative, to tell the story. Historians depend upon those fixed points. And so that order, I think, is probably what many of us in academic fields feel drawn to in our own disciplines. And discipline, that's a really good word to bring to this. And not just because it is the same root of the word disciple, and not just because we're talking about our fields in higher education, but it's basic dictionary definition. Discipline, the basic definition is this, I'm quoting Merriam-Webster, is to observe rules or a standard code of behavior with the purpose of bringing order to that which has none. Bringing order to that which has none. When you think about it this way, there has been more ordering brought to this cloth than anything else ever in history. With more beginning of the Age of the Shroud, its undisputed documented appearance of John Jackson in the VP-8 analyzer of NASA that gave us the info, which kind of blows the mind, the 1978 STIRT project. So we have all of these points at which the academic historian could say, well, it began here, it began here, it began here. So the limitations of the human capacity that exist even in my discipline of history, which is a little bit more objective than other liberal arts. So, when does the Age of the Shroud examination begin? Since I think that's kind of an interesting for the historian to ask, this is arguably the most unique object that's ever existed in history. So where do we begin the point? Because the qualities and the characteristics of this particular strip of linen cloth point to a scourging, a crowning with thorns, and a crucifixion that was done in Roman fashion, which has been eloquently expressed by other presenters here, a scourging, a crowning with thorns, and a crucifixion in Roman fashion, it appears to me, at least, and this should be an obvious point, that the man depicted on the cloth cannot be presumed to be anybody other than Jesus Christ. He cannot presume to be anyone else. It is not the image of some obscure, unknown, ancient, or medieval victim of torture, because there is no other man in history known to have suffered the unique, forensically demonstrated wounds that are on this cloth. There's no other person in history. The question should never be whether the cloth depicts Jesus Christ. It does. The question is how this undeniably unique depiction of Jesus Christ was made. And that's what we're about, right? Finding that truth. So this is the objective that has driven all of shroud examination. And we approach this, or some people do, with the idea that somehow it's going to, and that is a failing proposition for reasons that will become obvious. However, full disclosure, this historian standing before you today is presenting the Shroud of Turin, not the assumption, the conviction that the Shroud of Turin is in fact the burial cloth of Jesus, and it does in fact bear the light imprinted radiated image, however you want to describe that, of a resurrected Jesus Christ that is in fact mentioned in all four gospel accounts. So therefore, for me, the age of shroud examination doesn't begin in the 15th century, or even really, if we wanted to go back to the image of Edessa in the 1st century, shroud examination does not begin there. It begins with St. Mary Magdalene, St. John, and St. Peter at the arrival at an empty tomb. I am going to be using the Gospel of John, St. John, as an example of sort of contrasting or very, very different conclusions based upon having the same data, the same information, demonstrated very well in that particular gospel. And I'm going to talk just a minute about why I'm using this particular gospel. The three synoptic gospels, of course, always place Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is at the center of the resurrection narrative in the other three. She is the one who first learns of the resurrection and informs the others. Indeed, have Mary learning first, she has this direct angelic encounter, able, of course, process using that. But the historian, I stand before you today, and I gave you this disclaimer up front, the historian in me has to be naturally drawn to the best primary source. And who is that? Who's the eyewitness to all of it? St. John. It wasn't Mark, presumably writing Peter's account, is a good secondary source. Luke's not a contemporary. Luke's not an eyewitness. Luke's a companion of Paul, right? So it is St. John. So we have to look. The historian, I think, is more compelled than ever, reason that it's a good primary source, but because that I want to underscore today. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. And I know y'all have heard this gospel before today, but it's okay, you can hear it again. Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Peter then came out with the other disciple and went toward the tomb. They both ran, but as we all know, John beat him there, right? The other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first, and stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. He did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying, and the napkin, which had been on his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. Within St. John's account, there are two, arguably three, if you count, when we're going to be counting a later experience of St. Thomas, there are arguably three very different responses and approaches to the same event. It is difficult to know with certainty that Mary Magdalene entered the tomb, but we can assume from the reading of this that she did not. She arrived at the tomb early while it was still dark. She saw that the stone had been rolling away from the tomb, but she did not enter, because if she had entered, she would have seen what John and Peter saw, which was the empty burial shroud. So we can assume that she did not enter the tomb. St. Peter, of course, boldly enters, sees not only the shroud left behind, but also presumably what is known today as the relic of the Sudarum of Oviedo. John is clear that he at least peeked in to the tomb at first. He also comes to the conclusion that Jesus has risen from the dead. The most compelling evidence that Jesus has risen from the dead is not the empty tomb. It's not the empty tomb. If you go into the parking lot and your car is gone, you're not going to assume it drove away itself, right? The natural conclusion, perhaps is the one that Mary Magdalene reached without having full evidence, is that somebody had stolen the body. Grave robbery was a possibility. But we can assume this, that because St. John and St. Peter both entered the tomb, we can assume today that they both would have picked up, no doubt handled and held and marveled at this cloth, making them the very first shroud investigators in history. The very first. They were both the first pilgrims and the first scientists. So what is of interest about this particular primary historical source of St. John and what it relates to us about epistemology, or a way of knowing, is not in fact found in the reactions of St. John and St. Peter. Perhaps of greater interest is the reaction of St. Mary Magdalene, whose immediate conclusion was not that Jesus had risen from the dead, but that someone had stolen his body. This initial conclusion indicates, again, as I said, she did not see the burial cloths and seems to have missed what her companions have already processed. That morning, all three of these individuals were faced with something we confront every day in our lives. It's a principle in philosophy, basic principle. Philosophers have a fancy name for it. It is called the principle of sufficient reason. They're all three confronted with this at that empty tomb. The principle of sufficient reason simply means this: if there is an event or an occurrence, there is an explanation. And humans are programmed to seek it. I dare say that right now, if a flock of seagulls flew in here, there's not a person in this room who's going to look and say, okay, right? There's going to be, our initial, immediate, instinctive response is, why did that happen? What has just occurred? It's a universal philosophical phenomenon. It applies to all human beings. It's called the principle of sufficient reason. So the three are confronted with that. They need to know what happened. What explains this? Was the body removed by thieves, or was the body resurrected? And what evidence does one turn to for answers? So, again, it is a peculiarity to this cloth that the more that we know, the more we know we don't know. Every material object, every object of the material world gives up its information. It does. So, where does that leave us? The persistent questions that we have, and if we have persistent questions today, it's not from a lack of information, as I said earlier. People that will continue to allege that this is a medieval forgery, in light of the overwhelming data we have, actually obviates the opposite conclusion, is that it could not be a medieval forgery. Because a medieval forgery, by now, logic would tell us that that would have been revealed to us because of all the information that we have. So this unique condition of the study of this unique condition of the shroud points to perhaps more of a need than ever for us to engage the field of philosophy, for us to engage going back to the basics of how we approach anything with an expectation of knowing it. How do we do that? Philosophy hinges on the very essence of knowledge, and here's a key term: the human capacity to know it. A human capacity to recognize a conclusion when we have one. The challenge with the shroud is clearly a limitation of the human capacity. And honestly, I'm going to say this very directly, it's more appropriate, and I think, honestly, much simpler, if everyone could say that humans have the answer. The answer is there. We have failed to come to the conclusion because of the limitations of our human capacity, or perhaps our failure to accept it, the conclusion the shroud has already offered us. There are many people who are determined to deny that this could be the burial cloth of Jesus, much less bear a radiated imprint of a resurrected man. But let us remember that there are many people who never needed any proof at all still need none today. And for 550 plus years, since its first public display in Lille, France, until 1898 when Secunda Pia took that famous photograph, for over 550 years, no pilgrim, no one ever approached that cloth with anything like the knowledge you have today. And they venerated it anyway because they knew. All of this leads to this inevitable intersection between faith and empiricism. Faith and empiricism. So what I want to leave you with today, I want to posit this today, is that there's actually another epistemology at work. One that the traditional canon of philosophy, which would hold that it is either a Platonic, ideal, metaphysical reality that leads us to knowledge, or it is an empirical, that based of the Aristotelian universe, that those are the two primary epistemologies that frame all of Western thought. I would actually posit today that there's a third way at work that is apparent from the very first data, the very first encounter with the shroud. A third way. A stone rolled away, an empty tomb, the evidence left behind. There is the faith of St. John and St. Peter, hands down, the faith of them. There is also a famous example of an empirical approach that is found in the gospel. What greater empiricism is there than that of St. Thomas, who St. John quotes as saying, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." While St. Thomas, unfortunately for him, I guess, bears the moniker of Doubting Thomas into perpetuity, perhaps, this doubt is not doubt. This doubt leads to knowledge, it leads to certainty, it leads to a conclusion, it leads to truth. It is not doubt at all. Okay, this is a valid approach of all three of these men. St. John, St. Peter, St. Thomas came to the truth a different way, but they all came to the same truth, which of course is what the angelic doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas, tells us, is that faith and reason are synthesized in their destination, which is truth. Neither one of these epistemologies are inferior to the other. So we have these two that are very beautifully demonstrated in John's gospel. Few people really stop to consider, I think, what is a third way of knowing that's here at work. How Mary Magdalene came to know the same truth that her companions had already reached. In the same gospel account, just a few verses before St. Thomas professes, "My Lord and my God," in response to him actually having touched a resurrected Jesus, Mary Magdalene also saw Jesus. She saw him, but she didn't recognize him. She presumes he's the gardener. She heard his voice speaking to her, and she did not know him. In her human frailty, knowledge completely eluded her, and it was not because she had a lack of faith, I would suggest. It is not because she had a lack of direct empirical evidence, and it is certainly not because she lacked the rare experience of having an encounter with two angels. Think about that. It's not because she doesn't have all of this information. She turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned to him and said in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. So, consider all the ways that the evidence and the sensory inputs that she had failed her. Mary had just been in the company of two men who were already convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead, and as the first shroud experts, right, who were St. John and St. Peter, don't you assume they tried to convince her? They're the first experts, and they've tried to convince her. Yet she saw two angels sitting in the empty tomb, and she still could not grasp the truth that her companions already knew. She found the ultimate knowledge, the ultimate truth, in what is identifiably this third way of knowing, what can be called nothing less than a profound personal encounter. A profound personal encounter. Both of the traditional epistemologies that had been so perfectly suited for Peter, for John, for Thomas, failed Mary Magdalene. Interestingly, it would be subject for another study, but of course the Gospel of Luke relates sort of a similar, as I'm thinking about it now, similar epistemological parallel in the Road to Emmaus story, where the apostles actually spend time with Jesus, travel with him, converse with him, and don't know him. And it's only in an extraordinary and extrasensory experience that they encounter him. So again, in that story, the traditional epistemologies have also failed in that narrative as well. Okay, so Mary Magdalene, when he called her by name, she knew. This is an epistemology that cannot be taught. And as I said, this is not found in the traditional canon of philosophy. You're not going to take a Philosophy 105 or 210 or whatever course on epistemology and hear this explored, this supernatural encounter as a way of knowing anything, because it transcends even Plato's ideal forms. It's not taught. So we're left with faith and science and encounter, which I think is arguably the third way here. And how do they help us to reach the truth about the Shroud of Turin? It is an understatement to say that all human efforts that are going to be applied to proving that this is, in fact, the burial shroud of a resurrected Jesus are going to systematically fail. And all of those efforts are going to fail because we're seeking to prove something that is beyond human capacity. We are seeking to prove something that is beyond the physical world. Science is never going to be able to disprove or prove the resurrection. Are we at a philosophical impasse? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. For consideration here is the lesson from St. Mary Magdalene. Hers is an epistemology that is born in the failure of human capacity, not in the triumph of it. In the failure of our human capacity. It's perhaps the most humble posture with which to approach this cloth. Uniquely in this long history of shroud study, which again, more than anything else ever has it been studied, the shroud seems to call all of us, from whatever perspective we are bringing, history, medicine, chemistry, botany, whatever perspective we are bringing, the shroud seems to be calling us to something greater, a greater way of understanding that is not framed in empiricism, and it's not found in the metaphysical musings of a Platonic-inspired faith, but in encounter, a personal encounter, which is what I feel like we're all being called to in shroud study today. And I think I have 1 minute. Thank you very much for listening.